Hello students, it's Dr. Z here. We are at chapter 24. We're going to be talking about new imperialism, and new meaning it's the imperialism in the 19th century. All right, and as you can see by the graphic here, it's a challenging topic. So characteristics. We have an unprecedented acquisition of territory. If you look at, for example, the green countries, that is the British Empire, the expanse of it in 1900. There's a phrase, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire. Now you see why. But notice that this is the imperialism mainly of Africa. Okay. Through the 19th century is the imperial conquest of India under the Victorian age, is really known as sort of the height of that, right? But we're also seeing conquests in Asia as well. And we'll be talking a little bit about China and Japan as we get to the end. But you should be thinking about new imperialism mainly as the colonization of Africa, but also Southeast Asia. Okay. Supported by industrialization, right? So this is the big why, right? Why in the end of the 19th century does this happen? Right? That's the big question. And then industrial powers over non-industrial world, right? So this is, we talked about when we started talking about colonialism at the beginning of the year, we were talking about the history of the development of the third world, the history of globalization, right? This is all part of that. And particularly coming out of the Industrial Revolution. This is a major aspect of it. We're also seeing big national rivalries in the sense that European countries are seeing their colonial acquisitions as a way to grow their economies and to compete with each other. And one of the big differences, of course, in new imperialism versus the old imperialism, right, is that this is all about free trade, not about mercantilism anymore, but free trade. So, causes. Search for raw materials, search for markets for manufactured goods. There's your, basically the Industrial Revolution is a cause. All right. The national rivalries, with political rivalries, these are new nations, right, that are now all tasked with building themselves up. And strategic concerns fostered competition. So countries were feeling like they had to compete with each other. Cultural. So imperialism justified through ideologies of cultural and racial superiority, right? So it was justified is what that should say. So the things that we learned about social Darwinism and the pseudoscientific ideas in the end of the 19th century, right, upheld the idea that imperialism was good. Most white Europeans in the 19th century did not think that imperialism was bad. They thought it was just fine. In fact, the French had a word, the civilizing mission. They saw it as actually spreading the light of the West into undeveloped parts of the world. And this problematic stance causes lots of issues down the line. So the other cause is that after the Industrial Revolution, there's that second Industrial Revolution. So there's development of new things, like machine guns in particular, but also communication. And also your AP gods want you to understand that things like quinine enabled white Europeans to go into places and not be as sick. It's a bunch of key concepts. You can read those on your own. So we're going to start with a talk of the scramble for Africa. So if you look on the left, you see Africa in 1880, all right? And those are the colonial colonies that exist in Africa in 1880. But by 1913, the entire continent more or less is gobbled up by Europeans. And this is because of the Berlin Conference. So Bismarck organized this, and it was a formal agreement to decide which Europeans would, quote unquote, quote legally, and I put that in quotes there on purpose, own different parts of Africa. They also, quote, ended slavery by African and Islamic powers. Okay, Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness, very problematic book. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Called the conference the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. Yes, this is not why Europeans had abolitionist movements, though. However, okay, that is not the reason. So then the Congo Free State became essentially the private property of King Leopold II of Belgium. And also private property, legal property, all in quotes. Okay. Because, the Europeans, they went and they took it. These were strong movements to colonize. There's free trade introduced in the Congo Basin, free traffic on the Niger and Congo rivers, on the idea that, the Europeans are using this trade for themselves. The pillaging of this time, and we'll talk about it more in class, wreaks so much havoc on many places of the world. It's a very dangerous and very sad time for this type of colonialism is very brutal as well. So what did they agree to? That any fresh act of possession of an African country had to be notified by the colonizer to the other European signatory powers. So this is a very famous political cartoon that shows what the Berlin Conference really was, right? We do compare this to the Congress of Vienna in the sense of what happened, in the sense that European major powers were coming together to determine borders and sovereignty. However, the big difference, right, is the consuming of Africa, right? And notice the metaphor of the pie there being cut up into different portions. The French at the bottom says each has its share if one is wise, right? And so the Europeans were trying to think, how can we do this so that we don't go to war with each other? Some things that enabled the new imperialism were steamboats. Steamboats were to 19th century empire builders what caravels had been to the conquistadors. They extended political and economic power into hitherto inaccessible regions. And this comes from one historian reviewing the book of another. And the image you see on the left is a drawing from the book The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. But the idea that Europeans could go and go upriver into colonized areas and exploit them for their resources was a big part of this time period. Conrad wrote a whole book about it. It is a fictional book. It is a very controversial book as well. So he creates a parallel, though, in the book between London and Africa as places of darkness, questioning the idea of what civilized and uncivilized really means. And it's often taught in schools to encourage students to think about imperialism and racism as ideas. I remember it was taught in my school. I know our school has recently taught it as well as part of the English literature curriculum. The whole genre of post-colonial studies, however, though, argues quite strongly against the book. Famously by Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. Okay, he said that the novels it was an offensive and deplorable book. It dehumanizes Africans. That the author Conrad is blinkered with xenophobia, incorrectly depicting Africa as the antithesis of Europe and civilization. So you can see that there's two different ways to look at this book. Steamboats as well. Going here to South America. This is a Chilean port in the 1850s, and this illustrates the use of the river through colonization. So you see the European steamboat on the right, and then the local canoes that were created by indigenous people in the foreground as well. And I suspect the author wanted you to note the difference between these two. And the other technology is the telegraph. So Samuel Morse, y'all know what Morse code is, right? It sounds like do 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 do, right? It's basically a cable line that's dropped either over land or even it's under the water. It literally, the big steamships would drop these cables behind them. And as far as I understand, they're still in the oceans today. But these cables enable immediate messages to be sent from point A to point B. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the Crimean War. It was used in the Crimean War so that the British public they knew what was going on in the war in real time, which was a first in the history of wars and media. So it's dots and dashes that are assigned to each letter of the alphabet. And by 1866, we've got lines across the Atlantic Ocean. And Princeton University has a really nice page on the telegraphs and gives quite a lot of information on there if you're curious about some more. The third big technology is the Maxim machine gun, for the quite simple reason that a machine gun can kill many people from quite a distance. So this is a film remake of the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan. It was filmed in a neorealist style with the using the actual site of the battle as the place for the film. But you'll notice the British soldiers here lined up with rifles, and you see, right, all the Sudanese coming in. The idea then made people feel, notice that there's no, other than the line of guns, there's really no formation. There's some cavalry here in the background sort of ready to go, but these horses over here, they don't even have riders on them, right? So, in many ways, it's kind of a relaxed thing. Why? Because they know that they're going to win the battle before the people even reach them. And this is what happened. So in 1884, Hiram Maxim invented the machine gun. There's a picture there on the right, so you can see what it looks like with all of the the bullets for rapid fire. It was much quicker, not super accurate, but also but quite deadly, in the sense that the poet Hilaire Belloc said, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." And the numbers do not lie. So in 1893, 50 Europeans with 6 guns killed 3,000 Ndebele people in Zimbabwe. In 1897, only 32 Europeans defeated 31,000 members of the Nigerian army of the Emir of Sokoto. So that is, when you think about those numbers, 32 versus 31,000 or 50 versus 3,000, it's really making the Europeans feel very confident about their winnings. Winston Churchill said about the Battle of Omdurman, "The British infantry fired steadily and stolidly without hurry or excitement," right? We saw the picture of the horses, and the people weren't even on the horses. "For the enemy were far away and the officers careful, and all the time out on the plain on the other side." Right? And that's the key, right? That all the danger is happening to the other side, not to the British. "Bullets were shearing through flesh, smashing and splintering bone. Blood spouted from terrible wounds. Valiant men were struggling on through a hell of whistling metal, exploding shells and spurting dust, suffering, despairing, and dying." Right? So while the British were without hurry or excitement, right, there was a complete massacre for the other side, experienced by the other side. However, there's always a however. So the Battle of Ottawa is the Italians who were trying to conquer Ethiopia, to colonize it, versus the Ethiopians under Emperor Menelik. And if we look at this depiction of it, you will notice something different, right? It is not just Italians who have the guns. So the Ethiopians were trading with the Russians, and they bought machine guns and cannons and all sorts of weapons. The Italians had bad maps, bad footgear. They got 2 of their whole divisions' flanks got lost. One made it to the battle, but so they were basically down 2/3 of their people before they even entered the battle. And after this battle, which was a total slaughter, the Ethiopians just, the Italians had no chance. They stood no chance. The Ethiopians won by a landslide.